Our second speaker today, I think, I didn't check this, and you always be careful when you don't check facts. I think she came to us from Michigan, is that right? And native Wisconsin, right? Is that right? Yeah, native Wisconsin. Did you do graduate work or some work in Michigan too, or? Minnesota. Okay, well, yeah, I get it wrong every time. Okay, thank you. Lisa Shuley-Moore is Associate Professor of Natural Resources and Ecology and Management at Iowa State University. She's got a wide-ranging interest in research of landscape ecology and the dynamics of coupled human and natural systems. Several of her research projects address the strategic integration of perennials into agricultural landscape to meet multifunctional goals. Other projects address the establishment of restoration baselines and the impact of restoration processes. She's known for her involvement in many different types of projects and her high energy level. Some of her colleagues said, she just goes and goes. And she's author and co-author of numerous research papers. She's got an expressed interest in solving environmental problems, and probably for some of us, she's best known for her recent involvement in the agroecology projects. I'll give you the full name: Science-Based Trials of Row Crops Integrated with Prairie Strips, or what we frequently shorten to the acronym STRIPS. So, Lisa, talking about tweaking, adapting, transforming, and harnessing the power of prairie for agriculture in Iowa and beyond.
Well, thank you so much, Daryl and Laura, for inviting me here. It's the second time I actually get to follow Doug Ladd at a session. I followed him at the Stewardship Conference in Michigan, a couple of years ago. That's in Michigan, right? But he's a hard act to follow because so interesting and such great depth knowledge. I also want to start out with just a couple more thank yous. I get to present to you today, which I'm really excited about, but the work that I'm going to present is super collaborative and super interdisciplinary. It wouldn't be possible without the work of many, many other individuals. Pauline Drobny, is she in the audience yet? She's a big help, a big collaborator, colleague. Also Matt Helmers, who's my co-lead on the STRIPS project. Matt Lehman, Diane Dubinsky, and J.R. Buckle that provided a couple of the slides that you'll see here in a moment. And of course, those funding sources there at the bottom wouldn't be possible without them. So, are you ready for another story about prairie ecology? Yeah, okay. Well, this one's going to be about prairie ecology, but it's going to be just as much about agriculture and sociology. So hold on, be ready for that. And there's two reasons why I think it's really important to blend these topics. One, those prairie remnants that we also love, they're so dear. Of course, in the state of Iowa, they're sitting in this agricultural matrix. 85% of the state of Iowa is covered with an agricultural land cover. And 73% of the state is in row crop agriculture. So it's really important to think about that agricultural context. The other reason why I hope you're interested is because I think you as a community, as Doug alluded to, have a lot to offer the agricultural community in terms of your knowledge and enthusiasm for prairie. So I want to hit on that here in this talk as well. I'm not going to talk about how there's unintended negative consequences of agriculture on our environment, because living in Iowa or near Iowa, you already know that story very well. But I do want to take a second to remind us that we, here in Iowa, agriculture is our culture. And it has ramifications in the social fabric of our everyday lives in so many ways. And we are, as a state, statistics you're probably familiar with, we're the greatest, we produce the most corn in the US. We usually produce the most soybeans as well. We produce the most hogs, we produce the most eggs, and we produce the most ethanol. And as I say, we're proud of that. It's 20% of our economy. It adds up to over $30 billion a year. And so it really sustains, that culture sustains us in so many ways. And I think while prairie enthusiasts, prairie professionals have a lot to offer the agricultural community, we have to keep that in our mind, that we are really working in a culture that's dominated by agriculture. And a question that I want us to consider as a group is whether prairie can help us achieve a suite of conservation and production goals on the very same acres. That's one of the questions that I've been addressing in my work at the Tallgrass Prairie Center here as well. They're working on this as well. And I think there's good news, and the reason why I think that the answer to this question could be yes, and I'm not the only one in the room. I was really excited when I was reading the program for this conference, and there's another important advocate in the audience who also thinks it's the case. Daryl thinks it can. And I don't know if you had a chance to read on the website before you came or in the opening flyer a few of Daryl's words. To me, they were very inspirational, and I think they spoke to this topic. I'm going to read them for you here. Using prairie to address current environmental concerns and provide ecological services allows us to incorporate more of it into the landscape, while not replicating the diversity of the pre-settlement prairie. Utilitarian prairie plantings offer elements of that ecosystem. These working prairies provide biofuels, assist in flood mitigation, reduce soil erosion, and lessen nutrient loss while providing habitat for pollinators and other wildlife. Perhaps awareness of these critical services will influence society to endorse maintaining and restoring a more natural world, to counteract an ever-increasing human population and the accompanying potential for environmental degradation. Prairie restoration could be a major contributor to mending the rents in the fabric of our natural systems and aiding in global conservation efforts. And there's good reason to support those words, good science backing up Daryl's words. And we know from a really deep scientific literature, some of which Doug drew upon, that prairies provide a lot of function. And that's something that I think our Native American ancestors inherently recognized, and our European ancestors coming from a different continent, they did not. We all know this about prairie, that there's several attributes that allow for that function. But remember that folks in the agricultural community that have lost this prairie heritage don't necessarily recognize these attributes. And so we have to help them understand them. What about prairie confers this function? First of all, they're perennial communities. They're active all year long. And plants live more than 1 year. That's a stark contrast to the corn or soybean plants that most agricultural land managers are working with. They're diverse. They're native plants. They have deep roots and stiff upright stems. All of these are really important characteristics conferring function. And I forgot one more on my slide, which is they produce abundant flowers. There's also an abundant scientific evidence supporting this graphic here. This is a graphic that some of my colleagues and I have published in a couple papers. The idea that when you're in a landscape that's dominated by annual systems, that if you put a little bit of perennial in that landscape and you put it at the right place, that you can achieve a lot of environmental benefit through that process. We call this the disproportionate benefits strategic integration hypothesis. Kind of a mouthful. We're scientists, forgive us. But pay attention to that curve. The idea that if you put a little bit in there and you put it at the right place, you can achieve many of those functional benefits that you can in larger areas. Not all, but many of those. The key thing about this graphic that I want you to understand also is that it resonates with the agricultural community. because anytime you talk about taking land out of crop production, their immediate response is, that is a loss. If you're going to suffer a loss, there better be something big that compensates for that loss. And so the chance to achieve enormous environmental benefits with just a little land out of production, that resonates with the agricultural community. The big question in my mind is how. How do we go from the standpoint of recognizing the attributes of prairie and recognizing that little bits of prairie could do really great things in the agricultural landscape to actually getting them out there and providing those benefits? That's a really big question to tackle. And in order to do that, we really need everyone at the table to figure it out, including you all. The outline for my talk today, I'm going to talk about my efforts and others to try to gather people to the table and really envision a different future for Iowa agriculture, one that includes more perennial plants and hopefully a lot more prairie. The second piece of it is specific practices that can foster these changes, adaptations and transformations, I call them, of the landscape. Fourth, scaling it up. There's nascent things happening out there all over the place in the Iowa landscape, but how do we grow it, and how do we connect it, and how do we make it achieve those benefits that we want? Clean water and preserving monarch butterflies. How do we make that happen? And then more specifically, what I think you can do as a prairie community. So first, I'll start with envisioning the future. And the groups that, through my work, I've been trying to gather to the table are represented here. First, of course, farmers and farmland owners. They own the majority of the Iowa land base. They've got to be a critical piece of the equation. Also, the commodity organizations represented by that corn there. So the Iowa Soybean Association, Iowa Farm Bureau Federation, and increasingly agribusinesses. Also, environmental organizations like my colleagues here from the Nature Conservancy and Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation. And finally, folks in government, both state and federal government, that are critical in terms of providing needed funds and also oversight to the processes. The process, in terms of engaging these groups, has started with actually interviewing farmers, those people that are most closely connected to our Iowa landscapes. Secondly, focus groups with regional change agents. One of the things that we learned from farmer interviews is that they felt like they could do something different with their lands, but their decision space was so constricted in terms of opportunities, and they really felt like they didn't know how to change that. So regional change agents do know how to change that, so it's important to engage them. Third, the development of alternative future scenarios and visualization as a key tool for doing that. And fourth, follow-up interviews with both the farmers and the regional change agents. Some more good news. Among these multiple projects and processes, there's a lot of consensus among these different groups operating at different scales, from the farm level up to Washington bureaucrats. And there's huge consensus on the vision. We view a future for Iowa that continues to be an agricultural landscape, but we want more environmental benefits to also be derived from that landscape. Secondly, in terms of the strategy, also lots of consensus there. A huge need for landscape planning. Let's put corn and soybean on the acres that are most productive, but what are we doing tearing up infertile hill slopes to grow corn or soybean? Huge opportunity for landscape planning. And then also the need for cross-boundary partnerships. Cross-boundary, such as environmental organizations working with commodity organizations, but also a farmer working with their next door neighbor to achieve mutual goals. And in terms of tactics, improved infield management practices, things like precision fertilizer application or cover crops came up, but also a recognition that improved infield practices isn't going to completely get us where we need to go. At some point, we do need to talk about putting some land back into perennial cover types. The question is, where, what should that perennial be, and how much of it do we need to achieve the environmental benefits we desire? It's oftentimes easy to agree on broad principles and harder to talk about specifics. And that certainly is the case whenever you try to talk to somebody about what to do on their land. That gets contentious. To get around that, a former student of mine, Drake Larson, who's now a farmer in Canada, he developed computer visualizations of a virtual landscape, a fictitious place that nobody lived in. And he asked people to think about two things with this fictitious landscape. One, what environmental benefits were derived from this landscape? And two, at what point were the commodity benefits balanced with the environmental benefits? So those two questions, and I'm going to show you a series of these visualizations, and they step up by twos. So it's 2, 4, 4 times 2 is 8, 8% perennial, 16% perennial, 32% perennial. You can see and that's the amount of perennial vegetation that you see in that field of view. So this is the first landscape is just, you see a 2% perennial landscape, and it's just a buffer along that stream there. And here are the other ones. Okay, that went by quick, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about what you're looking at in these, and I got to tip it up so I can see it better. So 2% perennial is just a perennial strip along that stream there. 4% we add a nutrient mitigation wetland. At 8% it's a variable with buffer. 16% a bigger buffer with prairie strips in the upland. 32 another nutrient removal wetland and some grazing. And 64 more grazing as well as bioenergy production through herbaceous and woody plants. We brought these to various stakeholders and asked them those two questions. What benefits do you perceive from these, and at what point do the production benefits are they balanced with the environmental benefits? And I think with those two lower scenarios, the views of almost all the participants are summed up by this quote. And keep in mind that this quote was offered by an agronomist. These two scenarios offer very little beyond production value. It's so far skewed toward production that even the production benefits are likely compromised, at least in the long term. So there's a broad spread recognition that, well, add one more thing. This is what we heard from over half of our participants. Right? And so there was a broad spread recognition that what we have now in our agricultural landscape isn't going to be sustainable in the long term. Then on the other end of the spectrum, with 64% perennial vegetation, we began hearing this thing. You know, people would look really closely at the images and pick out the spot. We provide them with more than one for each water visualization or each percentage, but they'd scrutinize it very closely and say, this is where I put my house. Which to me, this is inspirational because this means that these are the landscapes that people not only want to work in, right? These are the landscapes that people want to live in and play in addition to just having it be a working landscape. And over 50% of our participants put the environmental benefits associated with this landscape as the highest. But not everybody. There were several participants that expressed this, as summed up with this quote. You know, definitely the last. There's nothing for me here. And you can already probably guess who these people were. These were the farmers in our group. These were the people that already owned big equipment, that had huge land assets, may have had huge debt, that knew how to farm this current landscape, but they don't know how to farm this one. They don't understand the function. They don't understand the potential market benefits from this type of landscape. So that's a huge problem if the people that are owning and working our current landscape don't see the environmental benefits associated with a perennial landscape. Or you could say it's a huge opportunity. We have work to do. The other piece of it, though, is that there was a consensus landscape. That somewhere around this, 15, 16% strategically targeted perennial landscape, a lot of people voiced that as a viable landscape for Iowa today. Recognizing that this is a step we need to take on a trajectory that in the future probably needs to include even more perennial. But this was one step along the way in that trajectory. And that, yeah, sure, the folks from commodity organizations, they wanted to push it down to 10%. And for sure, you perhaps that we interviewed, from an environmental angle, wanted to push it up towards 32%. But when push came to shove, this was the consensus landscape. This was something that people said they could live with. I've taken these different landscapes and sort of the different knowledge that we've harnessed from these stakeholders and sort of grouped them into 3 different alternative futures for Iowa. One is the tweak future, where we just keep doing what we're doing now, maybe playing around at the edges with precision fertilizer application, adding in saturated buffers or bioreactors here and there. But it would be pretty easy to maintain a tweak landscape. However, one thing I want to point out here that we have in the tweak landscape that we don't have in our current landscape is a continuous riparian buffer system. So it is a change from what we have right now, right? The adapt landscape, which would include much more perennial vegetation, something on the order of 15%. We don't have the mechanisms to achieve that right now, but we could very easily with public pressure, such as we're seeing with the Des Moines Waterworks lawsuit, such as consumer pressure for, say, alternatively raised crops. They provide a point by which we can get to more of an adapt landscape. But we need also policies that support a transition from a tweak to an adaptive landscape. And then finally, the transformative landscape requires so many different developments within our society, as well as our policies. It really requires rethinking our agricultural markets and really taking advantage of some of those functions of prairie plants and other perennials to produce marketable products. So grass-fed beef, prairie-based bioenergy, agritourism, and another thing that came up was payment for ecosystem services schemes to actually get to that transformative landscape. I offer these as alternative futures here, but in reality, there's pieces of this that are happening everywhere in the Iowa landscape that I look at right now. I think, as Doug alluded to, there's all sorts of creativity, there's all sorts of innovation going on in this state, and I can point to examples of each of these that are occurring. Today, I'm just going to focus on adapt and transform, because really, when it comes to prairie, there's no place for it in that tweak landscape. It may be, the roadside program that Daryl and others have started. That's a potential place for prairie, or a consistent riparian buffer. But there is no really big place for prairie in that landscape. But we do have opportunities with adaptation and transformation. So first of all, fostering adaptation, and here's where I'm going to talk about the STRIPS project. Just out of curiosity, how many of you have ever heard of the STRIPS project? Wow, I guess I can buzz through this section of my talk. I talked yesterday with a bunch of agronomists and farmers on the ISU campus, and there was only a couple of people that had heard of STRIPS. Okay. Well, I'm just going to hit on a couple highlights then. First of all, recognize that, again, it's a group and it's an interdisciplinary effort. There's about 50 people listed on this slide. So again, while I get to represent it today, realize it's the work of many. You may or may not realize, we've conducted our initial work at Neil Smith National Wildlife Refuge. It was a really important place to conduct this research. We couldn't have done it on ISU farmland at that time. Now we're putting prairie strips on ISU farmland, but when we started this project in 2003, started talking about it in 2003, it wasn't on the table. So the refuge formed a really important partner in terms of getting this innovative idea off the ground. And we used catchments on the refuge that had not yet been restored to native prairie, or they were dealing with invasive species issues, lesbideza, on the refuge, and so they were seeking to manage those. And within 12 small catchments, we implemented these four different treatments. The first is row crop agriculture, corn, soybean rotation managed with no-till. And all of the crop ground on our experiment is managed by Gary Van Ryswyk, who's a farmer near to the refuge, and he manages the crops just like he does on his own land. And then the 3 prairie treatments, with 10% of the catchment area converted to prairie, all at the base of the catchment. Secondly, 10% prairie again, but in multiple strips running along the contour. And then 20% prairie again in strips. This experiment was basically designed to test that hypothesis that I showed you at the beginning, that strategic integration, disproportionate benefits hypothesis. That's what we were trying to do here. And we chose prairie for the perennial cover. Now it seems like it was so obvious, but at the time when we had to decide what we wanted to plant in the patches and strips, it wasn't obvious. We talked about all sorts of things. Brome, I mean, it's part of the culture of agriculture already. It's easy for farmers to manage. It's cheap. We talked about, switchgrass, bioenergy switchgrass, given that bioenergy concerns were starting to build up. And we also talked about really crazy things like hazelnuts, because I have to admit I'm a forester by training, and woody plants are still near and dear to my heart. But luckily, we did choose prairie, and it was probably the best decision that we've made all along. What was the prairie that we planted? We planted 32 native perennials that first year in 2007. We added another the following year, golden Alexanders, to better support the insect community. And by 2011, we found that we had 39 of our native perennial species growing in these prairie strips, and 150% cover overall. So what we sowed here was successful at covering the ground, achieving a functional benefit that we were trying to achieve. It was also successful in that it was really diverse, and within a few years it was dominated by native species. It wasn't the pristine prairie, and it still isn't the pristine prairie that oftentimes we get in our mind's eye. It's, we converted many of these areas to brome, or from brome, and we're continuing to battle that brome as we move forward on these sites. But within 3 years, we were able to establish a diverse native perennial community on these sites. And again, remember that the corn is managed as corn-soybean rotation managed as no-till. And you may be aware of the in-depth scientific monitoring that we're conducting on whole watershed scales. For some reason, for some reason it's not very common to do this in the scientific literature, and I know the reason is because it's really expensive. But we were able to gather the funds to do this really depth monitoring where we can measure all of the runoff coming off of these watersheds. We look at the water in the soil. We look at birds, plants, we look at insects. We look at soil. We look at soil carbon. We look at soil communities, and we also have looked at greenhouse gas emissions. So we've basically taken the pulse of these 12 watersheds to really understand what they're doing and what is that functional benefit of the prairie. And this graphic, more than anything, I think has captured the attention of the agricultural community, and certainly for the farmers that we're working with now on their own land, they cite this as a source of motivation for wanting to consider strips for their own land. I mean, this picture says it all, right? This is after a 4-inch rainstorm in June of 2000, let's see, it's corn, so is it? Yeah, June of 2011, odd year. And the numbers that go with this, so this is one picture, you know, one day, it's all the same rainstorm. The numbers that go with this are consistent over time. And what we find is that when you take 10% of an area of these catchments and put it into prairie, we see that we're able to retain 95% more of the soil. So we're losing 95% less soil if we just put 10% of that area into prairie. Along with that, we maintain 90% of the phosphorus in that farm field, 84% of the nitrogen, and overall, we reduce the amount of water leaving that catchment by 42%. Those are powerful numbers. If you are a farmer, this is what Gary says, you do not want to lose your soil. If you are a farmer, you do not want to lose your nutrient inputs that you put on your crop field. And prairie might be a really great way to keep them in the crop field where they fuel plant growth and keep them out of our waterways where they become powerful pollutants. We've also seen that we're able to improve the foot slope soils within a very short period of time. This is probably mostly because of the soil that's been transported downslope from the fertile agricultural areas just upslope, but we're keeping it in the field. And we've increased the nitrogen in that foot slope soil by 100% and the soil organic carbon by 37%. I don't know about you, but you know, I get really bothered by this concept of tolerable soil loss in the state. And you know, as someone with young children, I think a lot about, okay, when are we going to talk about rebuilding our soils? And one of the functional attributes of prairie, right? It's built our soils. So prairie has a real opportunity to help farmers maintain that capital investment, that soil resource that's so important to them. The other thing is we see that if there's prairie in the foot slope, the nitrous oxide emitted from that foot slope position is significantly lower than if it's just in crop field. So for those of you, most of you probably know, nitrous oxide is a powerful greenhouse gas. So we're able to address climate issues with this as well. In terms of biodiversity, Luke's here. He helped with some of the early bird surveys. Overall, we've seen 52 bird species using our catchments, 11 species nesting. We see double the richness and the abundance when we have prairie strips in these catchments. We also see that 1.7 times the beneficial insects with the prairie strips and all of the pollinators that are found on nearby locations of the refuge that are in larger blocks of reconstructed prairie. So the biodiversity results look promising, but of course we know that in this case we're working in a national wildlife refuge and we're receiving a lot of recruits from nearby areas of the refuge, right? I mean, these organisms move. So we're really excited now to try to verify these biodiversity results. Now that we're having farmers and farmland owners come forward and want to put prairie strips on their own land, we can really solidify these numbers in terms of the potential for biodiversity benefits from prairie strips on farms. Important to farmers, there's no influence on the per acre crop yield for the crops, and there's no additional weed issues. You don't want to make weed issues for farmers, that's important. And the harvested prairie biomass equals 3.1 tons per acre, which is a head-turning figure for those in the bioenergy industry. It performs similarly to an unmanaged patch of switchgrass. And keep in mind that the most important reason to establish the prairie strip isn't for the biomass, but for those other environmental benefits. Still, this might provide a secondary benefit. So we do have lots of farmers coming forward. We've now have prairie strips on 22 commercial farms. There's several other farmers that are lining up to implement this fall. The Tallgrass Prairie Center is also in the process now of bringing forward farmers and farmland owners to implement prairie strips. And I just had a conversation this week with a major agricultural organization, and they're interested in promoting prairie strips through a large, one of the main co-ops that's active in Iowa. They're interested in promoting prairie strips as well. So I'm really excited that this really seems to be taking off and being embraced by the agricultural community. In terms of farmer sentiment, I think Tim Smith, one of our farmers, expressed, why prairie strips best of all. And I've had other farmers tell me that this phrase, conservation with a purpose, really resonates with them. And personally, I have to say that I didn't really understand what I didn't really understand what he meant when he first said it to me, and he said it with, very poignantly, like he wanted me to listen to it. I guess someone coming from a conservation background, we always think that conservation is purposeful, right? But if you are working from an agricultural standpoint and you've grown up, multiple generations under USDA policies, conservation for so many generations have meant land set aside, just taking land out of production for the purpose of reducing the amount of crops that are on the market. For a farmer, that's not very purposeful, right? If you're putting in prairie because you want to keep soil in your field, because you want to keep your nutrients in your field, because you want to be a good neighbor to downstream communities, you want to see monarch butterflies on your farm again, roosting, and you haven't seen that in 2 decades, because you want to hear birds, grassland birds when you get up in the morning, and insects buzzing around, because you might want to sell hunting leases on your land for pheasants and deer in addition to just growing row crops, because you might want to graze that prairie strip in addition to just having it perform the other non-monetary environmental benefits. That's conservation with a purpose. And here's just a map showing the 22 sites that we're working at now across Iowa and one in northern Missouri in your state, Doug. And we're trying to conduct research at all of these sites, which is a little scary and frenetic. But it's really important to be able to collect the data in this second phase of our research. I'm just going to touch briefly on a couple potential transformations that came out of the research with the stakeholders. And Doug already addressed this. So grazing native plants, that has a lot of opportunity. And here's Seth Watkins, who's one of our prairie strips operators, but he's also a cow-calf guy. And he does graze some areas with native plants. The great thing about this transformation is that we already have people doing it. There's already a lot of know-how out there on the landscape. We don't have to sort of, create something from scratch. I have Scott over there, who's one of the experts in the state looking at me. And one of my students a couple years ago went and talked to these experts and tried to pick their brains about, what their research needs were. There's a recognition that, yeah, we can make it work, but there's a bunch of things that we recognize we could do better. And here's a list of questions that these experts came up with in terms of information that would help them manage their native grasslands through grazing. And the great thing is that there's lots of research going on. I'm not doing this, but others are, in terms of how to better manage our natives through grazing. Doug alluded to some. Another project that's been ongoing at Iowa State University is the Patchburn Grazing Project. And they found that with patchburn grazing, you can support much greater diversity in terms of birds and insects than with traditional grazing mechanisms alone. And it provides a mechanism to really help livestock owners reconnect with our native biodiversity. And then another potential transformation is prairie as bioenergy feedstocks. And again, this is something that the Tallgrass Prairie Center has gotten into as well. This is a great area, I think, that our 3 Regents institutions could partner on because, of course, the University of Iowa is creating a market for this type of biomass. They have an ambitious goal to achieve 40% renewable energy by 2020. And as far as I've heard, the plan is to just keep going after that. And you may have heard in the news that meeting that initial demand, they're planning on using miscanthus, but they're open to using other perennial feedstocks as well, including prairie. In fact, one of our locations where we've got prairie strips now is the Eastern Iowa Airport. And the prairie that we grow there will then be burned in the University of Iowa biomass plant, go to run the student computers and keep the lights on in the dorms eventually. So that's pretty exciting. And of course, there's all sorts of research that, again, is supporting this particular transformation. Some of that done here. I know this example better because it's at Iowa State, conducted by my colleagues, Matt Lehman, Matt Helmers, and others. And a key thing that they've found in this research is that reconstructed prairie receiving fertilizer so that you can bump up the biomass and harvested each fall. It contained at least 22 plant species, lost almost none of that nitrogen to the drainage water, produced 3.4 times more root biomass than corn. See that and think build soils, root biomass, build soils. And then produced 2.3 times more cellulosic material, so more actual material that could then be transitioned into an energy system than corn. That's prairie function. So this is all well and good. How do we scale it up? I want to come back to, a few more data points, and then I'll come back to my interviews and focus groups with stakeholders. One key thing is that Iowans are demanding that we scale it up. Mentioned the Des Moines Water Works lawsuit before, but here's some survey data conducted by from my colleague J.R. Buckle and John Tyndall, asking Iowans what their priorities are for agricultural policies and programs. Where do you see crop production? So number 9, it's not that crop production isn't important, because it is. But in terms of our policies and programs for agriculture, let's let farmers and agribusiness handle the agricultural production. Our state and federal policies and programs should really focus on achieving these other benefits. Water is by far the most important. Drinking water quality for wildlife, aquatic life. Number 4, flood control. Number 5, water quality for recreation. Water is so important to Iowans. And then rural job opportunities also ranks really high in terms of what Iowans' priorities are. We've also just done a really quick and dirty analysis looking at how many acres are suitable for prairie strips in the state, and here's what you get. So what we looked at here is land that's already in corn and soy production and has a 4% slope or greater. And you can see there's substantial locations that could have prairie strips on, and prairie strips would do a lot if they were there. And we know which portions of the state to target. We're following this work up by working with a commercial business ag solver to do infield level precision profitability modeling to get a good understanding of also where prairie could help offset some of the costs associated with agriculture and improve overall farm profitability. And again, that's something that resonates very deeply with the agricultural community, is trying to maximize farmer profitability. And then I just wanted to share with you some data from the 2015 Iowa Farm and Rural Life Poll. This was conducted by my colleague Jay Arbuckle. And he asked the question, would you be willing to plant monarch habitat on your land? It was something more like milkweed and improved monarch habitat. But basically this is prairie, right? Monarchs need milkweed, but they need floral resources as well. And I think this also shows us what the potential is for prairie within our agricultural landscapes of Iowa. The overall answer was 42% of Iowa farmers, based on this representative sample, said they would be willing to consider planting prairie for monarchs on their land. I think this is an underestimate when we think about the overall environmental benefits that we want to achieve, because we just asked them about monarchs. And then we asked about, how would they do it? And many of them said they would just do it on their own. Others said they would need some kind of cost share, either 50% cost share. We asked them about 50% cost share and 100% cost share, and asked them how many acres they'd be willing to plant at these different levels. On their own, they'd be willing to plant, on average, for those that responded yes, 7.3 acres on their farm. 50% cost share, the number goes up. 100% cost share, the number goes up. And if you multiply this by the farmer response rate here, that 42% of all Iowa farmers, this represents a potential of nearly 500,000 more acres of prairie in the state. Again, I think this is a really conservative number. So money would help in terms of scaling it up. No surprises there, right? But our stakeholders also told us that money wasn't the only thing that mattered. There were other things that were really important in terms of being able to scale up this idea of strategically integrating perennials into the Iowa landscape. And a key thing is just at the field or individual level, willing landowners, people that are willing to think differently about their land, people that are willing to take a little risk, people that are willing to think about profitability in addition to yield, or potentially even taking a little hit now and then, or at least walking into an office and potentially finding out about cost share. But for some people, this is risky. It's really risky, especially when you have a very large mortgage on your farm or on equipment. And so we need more willing landowners to step up. And a key piece in order to get them to do that is the current farmers that are doing this to become champions for the practices. And we're seeing that happen now, which is exciting. Also, at a higher level scale, it was recognized that we need more partnerships. Partnerships like what Daryl started with the roadside vegetation management program, decades ago with roadside managers. People partnering together to figure out a solution. What we see now with the Nature Conservancy in the Boone River of Iowa, partnering with farmers and Iowa Soybean Association, John Deere. We need more of these innovative partnerships, people talking together, getting to know each other, understanding each other's values, learn from each other in order to move things forward. And the third thing people talked about is that they really needed to get consistent messages and consistent support from the regional change agents. So if those regional change agents could support those local farmers, if they could support these community efforts in a very consistent way and advocate for policies that help people make these transitions, that was seen as a really key part in terms of overall fostering change. And in particular, they said that they would like these regional change agents to advocate for this 15% solution. This idea of converting 15% of our current Iowa annual crop landscape into strategic perennial land cover. So I'll just end with a few comments on what I think this all means for this community, and I'm sure you have some other ideas in which I'd love to hear at the end, but here's just some things that I was thinking about as I was preparing to talk with you. One is to be open to possibilities. So the opportunity to plant prairie on farms is a possibility. It's a possibility to reconnect the Iowa landscape in a way that it hasn't been connected for over 100 years. It's a possibility to try to achieve disproportionate environmental benefits. And it offers an opportunity to teach people that don't have a culture of prairie about what prairie can do. Be open to that possibility that prairie can do that, but it's probably not going to look like the pristine prairie of your favorite remnant, or that maybe you even have in your mind's eye. Share your knowledge and enthusiasm. It's infectious. It's awesome. We need a lot more natural historians, and we need to help people understand, like I said, the functional benefits of prairie, but just the awesomeness of biodiversity and all of these biological interactions and the human biological interactions that are what prairies are, both today and historically. But also a word of caution, that when you share your passion and enthusiasm and knowledge with the agricultural community, try to meet them where they're at and recognize that it's a very different place oftentimes than where you're at. And the learning that can happen both ways when you offer that willingness to listen and learn in addition to teach can be quite profound. And then finally, foster more of these innovative partnerships. They're really hard work. And people involved in them, they need to hear that it's worth it because it's a really long haul, and oftentimes late nights and a few setbacks before you have successes. So, tell Daryl and Laura and all the folks in the INHF crew and TN3 crews here that, what they're doing is worth it. They need to hear it because it's really, really hard work. And then tell others in your community about this important work so they understand as well. And I just have to put in a plug for IWIL as long as I'm here. That's part of, that innovative partnership, providing that funding that allows us to do more of this really good work in terms of building these partnerships. So this has largely been a story about Iowa, but it also has a global context. And those were in Daryl's words that I read to you. Doug talked about this a little bit, and I want to end with that. So Iowa agriculture, with all its warts and glory, right? We export it worldwide. We not only export our agricultural crops, we export our agriculture. And I think we have an opportunity to make that an agriculture that's vibrant, that's diverse, that's something that we can be proud of, that's self-renewing. And in order to do that, Prairie's got to be a part of it. So share your knowledge and enthusiasm. Let's make it happen. Get to work.
We got time for a few questions.
Okay.
There are a few questions. We got time for some comments and questions. Go ahead.
Go right here in the blue.
Thank you. I've been working in the Raccoon River watershed for 10 years, and I'm happy to see your map has that region as kind of low priority because of slope. But I would guess that even with a very low slope, you'd be taking out a heck of a lot of nitrogen from the prairie strips.
Mm-hmm.
So I just want to make that comment. I think phosphorus too is transported in the water as well as in the soil. You know, the soil loss is going to be most important for your
Right. So that map was, like I said, very, very quick and dirty, but at least gives us some sense of based on slope. One of the things that we've been really surprised about is that there are farmers coming forward that don't have much slope that are interested in prairie strips, because even though they don't have steep hillsides, they know they still have erosion on their farms. They see it when they work their fields. And especially with the wet springs that we've been having more recently, they see the results of that erosion. They just want to slow that water down. It's likely in the tile drain landscapes of the Des Moines lobe that prairie strips won't provide the same level of nitrogen benefit. The Neil Smith site that we're working, the tile, there's some old tile there, but it's not active. And the nitrogen mostly is flowing with the water, and in these tile drain landscapes, it's moving with the tile, right? But at the same time, there's an opportunity to start pairing conservation practices, and we have one farm that's come forward in Grundy County that we're working with. These landowners are interested in pairing prairie strips with a saturated buffer, so treating both the above ground and the below ground water component. And so I think that has a huge opportunity to address your concern. Yeah.